PowerShell is one of those things where it's really, really easy to get into. Kind of once you get over a little bit of a hurdle and you understand what the commands look like and how the help system works, like there's a couple of things you have to know. And then once you're into it, it's pretty straightforward. And for better or for worse, when the team designed it, they kind of designed it to provide an entry ramp for several different audiences. And this was a good idea in that it got people into PowerShell quickly, and a bad idea in that it got them into the dark, hidden, dusty, nasty, musty corners of PowerShell sometimes. So you could approach PowerShell a lot like you approached VBScript. You could treat it a lot like you would treat a batch file. Or you could go at it like you would go at a C# program. Those are sadly all wrong. You can do it, but you will get yourself down a path where you start fighting the shell because you get to a point where it says, yeah, except I'm not really VBScript and I really want you to do it this way. And it turns out you should have been doing it this way all along and your life would have been better. So that's what this session is really all about. It's taking that command that you figured out in the console on the command line and turning that into a reusable tool that fits PowerShell's native patterns and practices. So we're not going to be fighting the shell. Now, for a lot of people, this means unlearning some things, and that's fine. That's what we're here to do. For some people, it means, oh, I didn't realize that's why you never do it that way, and that's great. That's what we're here for. So make sure you're asking those questions. Why'd you do it that way? I'm going to post all my code. I'm going to post it on donjones.com. It'll be there forever. So those of you with computers, do not spend your time here trying to copy my code. You will not be able to keep up with me. I type very fast and I type while I talk. I want you to be looking at the code on the screen and I want you to know why it's up there. And if you don't know why it's up there, ask, because that's the important part. Okay? All on the same page there? All right, so let's just start with something really, really simple over here on the shell. What we do with the tool that I'm going to build today is not as important as how I do it, right? It's about the tool making. That's the important bit, not necessarily what the tool does. So I want to keep the actual task we're performing a little bit simple for two reasons. One, I don't want to get caught up on that task. Two, I want it to take up very little screen space because I have to jack my font size all the way up so that you can read it. So the less code I have, the more I can fit on the screen. So let's just do something simple with sim. Get sim instance. Let's do this from a remote computer, DC. Can you guys read that okay, except for the dark gray? It's a terrible color choice. Let's do Win32 operating system. That's a fun one. You do have to spell it right. That's important. It doesn't want to tab complete today. System, let's just that. Okay, that didn't work. Let's see why.
It looks just like black text, though.
Nice. I'll show you my fun little trick for that in a sec. Is my network hooked up? Oh, no, it's not. That's why. Set Dawn VM. Come on, you can do it. No, apparently you can't. Well, here. Two things. First of all, host.privatedata.error foreground color equals green. There. Plus it feels nicer, doesn't it? Like that's life affirming. All right, let's just do something local then real quick. Okay, what's the computer name here? That is why. I think I'm in the wrong VM. Wonder how many of these I have. Windows 10. Yeah, that's the one we're running. Oh, you know why? Let's do it in Windows 8. This will work. Get sim instance, computer name DC, class Win32, operating system. There we go. Okay. So this works. Is that still legible in the back of the room?
Yes.
Font is sufficiently. All right, let's get the Now, I'm going to use the ISE here. I don't really care if that's what you prefer or don't prefer. I'm not going to suggest the ISE is perfect, but in a lot of situations it's good enough. And I use it because it's what everybody has. And my goodness, that's tiny. There we go. Everybody at least has this. I don't know if you've seen, there's a new enhanced ISE that's out in kind of preview mode. You should take a look at that. That'd be something great to talk to the team about. They'll probably want to hear what you think of it. You know, Visual Studio Code has got support for PowerShell now. You can use that. Sapien's got editors out there. You can use that if you want to. I'm going to use this because it's relatively uncluttered. Let me get that a little smaller. So I almost always, when I begin the tool making process, I almost always start in the console. And here's a key thing, and I'll get into the why behind this a little bit more. I never start in the console pane of the ISE. The ISE works differently than the console. It maintains its memory and scoping differently from the console, and there's a reason for that. It is a development environment. You should not regard it as a test environment. You will get different results. So I always start in the console. That's my lowest common denominator, and I always get my command running there first. So let's just let's do one more command. Let's get a different class here, computer system. Okay, that worked. Once I know everything works, I'll go ahead and copy and paste it into a new script. Single pane. Computer system. Okay. What about this is a script right now. This is officially a tool. I could give this to somebody else and they could run my script and it would automate those tasks. There's one thing wrong with this as a tool, and there's one thing that's suboptimal about it. Let's start with the suboptimal bit. What here is not optimal? I've got the hard-coded computer name. So, I mean, I could just give this to the help desk and say, look, if you want to use this, just open it up in Notepad and change the computer name. I mean, don't change where it says computer name, but change, yeah, I can already see this going badly. The other thing that this does wrong, and this is a hugely important concept that's going to drive a lot of what we talk about. This is emitting two different types of objects to a single pipeline. When I ran this over here in the console, I got two separate pipelines. I ran the first command, I hit enter, that's a pipeline, and it produced its output. I typed the second command, I hit enter, it ran it into a second separate new fresh pipeline, emitted its output, and that's what I got on the screen. When I run my script, if I were to type my script name and hit enter, I get one pipeline. And everything that script emits goes to that one pipeline. PowerShell does not work as well by default when you've got multiple different things in the pipeline. In fact, on a routine basis, you probably only run one command that deliberately puts two different types of objects into the pipeline. Tell me what that is.
Get child item.
Dir, get child item. Because it produces file and folder objects, right? And it produces a pretty good looking display, doesn't it? I mean, it's perfectly legible. Do you want to know why? Do you want to know what Microsoft had to do to make those two objects actually work? Look at this nonsense. Let's cd ps home. And we've got all these XML files in here. There we go. Notepad file system. They had to do this. All this XML exists solely to make sure your directory listings look good when there are two different objects in the pipeline. You are not going to be doing that every single time you write a tool or a script. So you need to limit yourself to one kind of output in the pipeline. That is important. And that often involves significantly rethinking the way you approach your command. So when you sit down to begin with, you have to be thinking, what is the one kind of object I'm going to want out of this that will serve all my needs? Only one. So let's start by getting rid of that hard-coded computer name. We'll add a parameter block to the top of our script, declare a parameter called string, that is a string called computer name, and we will use that in place of the hard-coded. So we've taken care of this, the suboptimal bit now. We have a parameterized thing. Why did I use $ computer name? Why didn't I put host or machine?
Because host is already
At the end of the day, every other PowerShell command that accepts a computer name does so on a minus computer name parameter. Our goal is to be consistent with the rest of the shell. When I sit down and look at a command and I want to see if it supports other computers, I look for a minus computer name parameter. Be consistent. Don't invent new crap. The whole thing that was a problem with the old command.exe shell is that every single command had a brand new set of parameters you had to learn. How many of you have ever run iCackles without looking up the syntax in an example first? Right? Because there's like 82 different cackles. So there's cackles, there's decackles, there's dsackles, there's icackle, there's xcackle, and they all have different parameters. Well, the whole point of PowerShell was to try and fix that with consistency. So stay consistent. Be consistent. So now that we've got that in there, let's take care of the other bit. Who thinks we should be accepting more than one computer name? Sure, let's do that too. There. Now it accepts more than one computer name. Now we have to start thinking really carefully about how we want this to work, because we've got a couple of potential things going on. This will work perfectly if I run it as is. It's wrong, but it'll work. Let's say I run this with 3 computer names. What's going to happen? What's the output going to look like?
It's going to be 3 of line 6 and then 3 of line 7.
It's going to be 3 operating system objects and then 3 computer system objects. That's probably not optimal. That's probably not what we want. Another problem, what if the second computer name I give it isn't there?
Terminate.
It won't actually terminate. PowerShell commands hate to terminate. They will go to great lengths to just chug through and keep on going. So we're going to get an error message in the middle of all of our output. And the thing is, because I'm just giving each of these 2 commands a whole block of computer names, I don't actually have any way of knowing which one failed. Like in my code, I don't get to see which one failed. So here's what we're going to do instead. We're going to do a little for each loop, and I am immediately going to go indent the code that lives inside of this thing, because people who do not format their code correctly are bad people. I'm not saying they're as bad as like a pedophile, but it's really close.
How did you get it from line 6 to jump down to line 8 the way you did?
How did I get it to do line 8? I went to the end of line 7 and hit enter.
Oh, that went so fast.
Yeah.
I didn't see it.
Yeah, I'm quick like a bunny.
Okay.
Hey, Don, I have a quick question.
I got to fix one thing real quick, because I'm enumerating my computer names, but I got to fix that right here. If you guys distract me, I have not had enough coffee to catch that. Go ahead.
So just a kind of a fundamental question. I've always tried to avoid doing multi-string like that and passing multiple computer names and operate from the standpoint of PowerShell's object-oriented. If I want to pass multiple computer names to a tool or function that I'm writing, then I should use a getAD computer or get content or whatever and pipe each computer name in as a single entity. Then I don't have to do a for each loop. I'm simply processing each one inside my process block.
Yeah, so the short version of that is, why don't I just only accept a single computer name and pipe computer names to it? We're going to get there too, but if you look at the patterns that PowerShell itself follows, it often allows both. Meaning, I can do a get child item on a single directory, but I can also do it on multiple directories at the same time. So I'm trying to stick with the patterns that the shell supports, because, and this is the reason the shell does that, I can't predict how some Yahoo later on is going to need to use this. And I don't want to predict. I want to create as much flexibility in here as I can so that I don't need to go back later and make some changes. This might be the first thing in the pipeline at some point.
Yeah, I just want to say, based on that, this way will allow you to do tool name dash computer name parenthesis get AD computer blah 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 blah.
Yeah, there's.
And then piping it in there, you can use it on that side.
Yeah, there's a lot more patterns, and once we get this to a point where we can run it, there's a lot more patterns I can use to input those computer names, because sometimes the output of another command is not going to be suitable for this. So there's other things I can do to use that anyway. So it's just a broader set of patterns we can support. Okay, so we've got this. This is now going to go through each computer name one at a time and query both objects. We're still outputting 2 objects. That's still wrong. So to prevent the computer from outputting those, we're going to capture the output to a variable. So now both of those objects are being captured to a variable. They're not going to the pipeline. If I ran the script right now, what would my output be? Nothing. So so there's a major version. What else do we want on here? OS version? Want that? OS version? Version. Nobody cares about the OS name. Microsoft doesn't even know what the OS names are.
Serial number?
Model. Let's do that. CS model. MFGR is CS manufacturer. Oh, thank God for tab completion. That's enough for right now. New object, type name, PS object, properties. So I've created a new object from scratch. I have populated it with a combination of information from my 2 bits of SIM data that I retrieved. I am actually, and this will make a lot more sense later, I'm going to save this to a variable as well, and then immediately output it. I do this for 2 reasons. One, there are a lot of situations where before you output that new object, you want to do things to it first. And so this is a pattern that lets me stick more code in between those. And the other, and this is a really important code maintainability point. I don't like to implicitly write things to the pipeline. I like to explicitly do it so that I can come in here and quickly put my eyeballs on the exact spot where my output is being produced by looking for the command write output. Whereas if I just did a new object, it's implicitly outputting that. I like to be a lot more explicit. Notice I do not use the return keyword. How many of you use the return keyword? Stop it. It's only there to fool you. Microsoft, there are people on the team who significantly regret having done that. They call it syntax sugar, and they only put it there because developers were going to look for it because they were used to it, but it doesn't do what it should do. Now that's different when you get into classes in version 5, but we're not there. We're writing a script, not a class. Don't use the return keyword. It doesn't do what you think. And all you're doing is creating a maintainability problem for somebody else later on down the line.
On your properties variable that you've created there with your hash table, I tend to just use the type accelerator, the PS object type accelerator. Yeah, so when instead of using the PS object type accelerator, yeah, there's about 4 different ways I could have arrived at that new object. I almost, just as a personal preference, and this isn't right or wrong, I almost always take the most explicit route to get anywhere. A lot of developers, especially C# guys who are used to casting an object with that square bracket syntax, will use the PS object type accelerator, and that's fine. The big difference is that my version will work in older versions of PowerShell than yours. So, and I tend to have a habit toward long form.
So does this just say basically, hey, PowerShell cast this to whatever you think it is?
Does this basically just say PowerShell cast this to whatever you think it is? No, this is just a hash table, and this is explicitly creating a PS object type of object, and then giving it properties that correspond with my hash table. So I will have a computer name property, an SP version property. So there's no casting going on. PS object is just a blank object that has a couple of things wired up to it already that is for this exact purpose. This is why it exists. Yeah?
Is there an advantage to PS object over the old PS custom object type?
There's no difference between PS object and the old PS custom object. This is just shorter. That's all. They did it for brevity. It aligns well with the PS object type accelerator syntactically. So if you're used to one, this tends to make sense. Good questions. So obviously I could stack as much into that property hash table as I want to. There's another whole technique where you create a blank PS object and then use the add member command to repeatedly add members to it. That just gets really lengthy. This is a lot more, I think, concise, and it's easier to put your eyeballs all on the data in one spot.
Is there ever a time you would want to do it?
What's that?
This is faster for the loop too.
Yeah, this is moderately faster. You know, when you talk about PowerShell and speed, you got to remember that it isn't fast, period. And so the degrees of slowness are what you're battling. This is a couple degrees less slow than the other way, yeah.
Is there ever a time you would want to use the add?
Is there a time when you would want to use add member? Yeah, add member is really useful if you're getting an object out of another command already and you want to tack a couple of things onto it. Meaning you're not creating it from whole cloth, it's being given to you, and you want to add a couple bits. So, as an example, I could have taken my operating system object and run it through add member a couple of times to just add model and manufacturer, and then I would have the whole operating system object plus a couple extra things. So yeah, you might do that. But the add member is really lengthy. Keep in mind too, that I hate people who in a script don't type out all their parameter names completely. Right? Bad people, nearly as bad as the people who don't format their code, which is nearly as bad as pedophiles, right? So that's the stack rank. And so with the add member, because you have to use all three parameters and the parameter names are very long, the thing stretches off the side of the screen and makes for a bad presentation. So that's kind of like my key thing. Can I fit it all on the screen at once? So at this point, we have a pretty functional little piece of hunk going on. Let's save it.
Your spacing's inconsistent on the computer variable.
No, it's not. Don't be like that. Get OS info 1. I would normally never put, so if you look at that script name real quick, I would normally never add the 1. We're just doing that because we're going to have several iterations of this here in class and I want to save them separately. That's all the reason. What are you talking about with my spacing?
Your casing.
Casing. Oh, I don't care about that.
Almost as bad as the people.
No, it's not. PowerShell is case insensitive and so am I. Actually, a lot of people tell me I'm just generally insensitive, but whatever. Screw those people. All right. Get-os tab to complete. This is still a script, so I have to make sure I'm providing a path, right? PowerShell won't run a script without a path, so we're just going to do this. And I got nothing because I didn't give it a computer name. Win81. Oops. There we go. Two different computers, two different objects come out. PowerShell has displayed these in a list form for me. That was its default decision. Do you know why?
Because of how many members there are.
Because it has 5. Anything more than 4 is a list. 4 or less defaults to a table. That's all that is. We can get into customizing that later if you want to. However, two things to note at this point. One thing I see people do wrong a lot. This really frustrates me, so don't do it. Up here at the top, they'll do like an out variable, and they'll set it to an empty array. And then down here, they'll append their new object to that array. And then at the very bottom, they'll output the entire array. The net result of that looks the same. And so it's very difficult to understand that you are breaking gravity and people are going to fall off the planet.
Because that breaks the pipeline, right?
Because when I run this in the pipeline, I have now created a blocking command. Normally, the pipeline does a pseudo multi-threaded kind of thing where one object at a time is flying through different commands and there's other objects behind it, so all the commands can run kind of in parallel. There is a time and a place to do this technique. For example, the sort object command does this internally. It has to because it can't sort everything until it has everything. But unless that's the type of command you're writing, don't do this. This is something that a lot of folks who are, again, programmers, are accustomed to having to manage their own output stream. You don't have to do that here because PowerShell does it for you. So just write it to the pipeline. write it to the pipeline, and let the shell do its thing. Hand it off and walk away. Okay, that's an important piece here. We do not have any kind of error handling in this. This might be a good thing to go ahead and add at this time. So where might I expect an error to occur? Just shout it out. Line 6 or 7, probably. Yeah. So I kind of have a little bit of an inefficiency going on here that I'd like to kind of correct at the same time. In fact, before we get to the error handling, let's maybe talk about the inefficiency here, because we want to build tools that work well. Can you see anything here that's maybe suboptimal in terms of how it's using the computer resources?
You're connecting twice.
I'm connecting twice. There is a perhaps trivial but greater than 0 amount of overhead involved in setting up that SIM connection and then tearing it down, and then setting it up again and then tearing it down again. So rather than doing that, I think what I would like to do set up a session. Oops. New sim instance. Why doesn't it want to complete my session? Oh, yeah, it thinks I'm stuck. Let's get rid of both of these. Is it sim or? All right. I've been dealing with the new version too much, and they made some changes in one of the betas, so let's just help at this real quick. Help, stop. Help, get sim instance. I can't remember if it's, all right, dash sim session, that's what I'm after. So sim session, right, sim session, session. Its tab completion is a little afraid. Now that I've made that change, where can I expect my error to occur? Line 6. Is it safe to say that if line 6 works, line 7 and 8 will also work? Assuming I've tested them and they don't have a typo or something, right? There's a difference between a typo. I'll get into arguments with people. Well, I just want to wrap the whole thing in a try catch in case there's a typo. No, fix the typo, right? You actually want to see that error message. Don't just shut off all the errors because some of them are your fault. As scary as they are with the red text, change it to green, right? That's why we do that. So I'm going to wrap. I'm going to put a try here. Where is the sensible place for my try block to end? It is not after line 7. It is actually all the way down here. Because if line 7 fails, I don't want anything else to happen. If 7 fails, I can't do 8, I can't do 9, and if I don't do 8 and 9, then there's no damn point in doing 10, 11, 12, 13, or any of the rest of it. So if I get an error on 7, I want to abandon ship and go do something different. So that's why it's structured that way. Yes?
I'm afraid of your response from answering asking this, but so why not just like put your catch after the session and then use a throw with an error and terminate the process? You know.
So why don't I just terminate the process? I don't want to terminate the process.
Well, I mean, just that iteration of the for each with a throw.
You'll-
It'll throw one error, but it'll do your next iteration.
You'll see why. I'll show you. We're going to handle the error rather than just barfing it. Sometimes that's the right approach. Sometimes when an error occurs, but keep in mind that when you throw within a scope, you're not going to throw yourself to the next iteration of a for each. You're going to toss yourself out of this scope. The script is going to end. And I don't want that to happen. I want to keep going.
What about nested try-catch?
There is a time and a place for nested, right? If you think, for example, that line 7 here might fail for some reason and line 9 might have a totally different failure that you need to handle, then yeah, you would have a more specific nested one around that, and that would be fine if you've got a way to handle that separately. So there's one thing I'm missing on line 7 to make this all work. What is it?
Error action.
Error action. Thank you. Error action stop. Because normally the shell is going to try and keep on going. It would run line 7. If there was a failure, it would say, hey, there was a failure. I'll get an error message, but I will not get a trappable exception. And there is a difference between an error message printed on the screen and a trappable exception that I can catch in my code. Stop forces it to do a trappable exception that I can then catch. That is also why we had to enumerate the computer names and only do one computer at a time, so that if it breaks, I can still loop back up and do the next computer. So here's what I'm going to do. We're gonna walk into something here. This is not the cleanest code yet, but we're doing this for illustrative purposes. If I fail to connect to a computer, I am still going to output the exact same kind of object. I'm just going to null out its properties. Now, there's actually a slightly better way that I prefer, that I tend to use in production, which is this. Oops. This means I can take the output of my command and I can sort or filter for the computers that were successful or not successful.
So do you still need to be explicit and put those set those as null?
You don't, well, you got to set them to something because you want them to be there, right? We want one type of thing going to the pipeline. What I don't want is sometimes the object has these properties and sometimes it doesn't have the properties. It needs to have the properties and they have to be set to something. You could set them to an empty string, except on the top half, things like SP version aren't a string, they're an integer. So you could set it to 0, but that doesn't actually, 0 might be a valid value, and you don't have a valid value here, you have nothing. And that's why I tend to do null. It's more the semantics, the meaning of it, than the actual syntax of what you type. I've got some wasted code here. There is no reason, this is identical code. There's no reason for it to exist twice. So I'm going to delete it here. I'm going to delete it here. And I'm going to put a finally. Finally will run after try if there was no error, or it will run after catch if there was an error.
It also runs if you hit Control-C.
It also runs if you break out. We're not worried about that right now. Don't hit Control-C.
Why don't you do a test connection?
Why don't I do a test connection? A couple of reasons. Test connection is just a ping. Just because I can ping a computer does not mean I can connect to its SIM service, and vice versa. Just because a ping fails, maybe the firewall is blocking ICMP, but it's going to allow SIM. So because I don't have a working test SIM session, all it would do is what I'm doing here. I'm doing this. This also fails faster than a failed ping. And even if, let's say there's a situation where a computer accepts the ping, so that passes. And let's say I did have a way of just testing to see if the SIM port was open, right? 5985 or 5986 by default. That still doesn't tell me that I'm going to be able to authenticate, that I'm going to have permission to query. So this kind of rolls the whole thing up into one failure, ideally. Good questions. Notice that I am not. Here's something else I see folks do that really troubles me. I am not merely querying and then testing to see if I got a null object back. Right? You'll see folks say, get sim instance, blah, 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 minus error action silently continue. Oh. And then their next line will be, if OS is null, then I know I didn't get anything. Don't do that. That's terrible. There are times when a command is working perfectly and legitimately returns a null value. For example, get sim instance minus computer name, whatever, minus class name Win32 tape drive. How many of your servers still have a tape drive? What would you expect to, what is a tape drive? Did she just ask that? Thank you. Thank you. Now I don't feel old. What would you expect to get back from that query? Normally, nothing. You're not going to get an error because it is legitimately returning null. So it's fine to check for a null result as an expected result, right? If we didn't have a tape drive, then I'll skip this section of code, that's fine. But don't use checking for a null result as a method of error handling. See the difference? In that case, the null result was not the result of an error. It was a result of a perfectly normal non-error situation.
I gotta ask then, why would you, in following, in the scope of that, why would you return this object with no properties?
Why would I
Not
return?
return null.
Why would I return the object with no properties? Keep in mind, I might be querying 20 computers, and I want some way of knowing which ones failed. And I need to output something. Just take the room apart, man, that's fine. They just remodeled. Just remodeled. I want some way of being able to track which ones failed. I might want to group those off differently at the end of the pipeline and write them to a text file so that I could try them again later. This gives me output for the failed computers, so I can do something with it. Don't know what that is, not trying to predict it, but it means I'm not losing information. For every object in, I get an object out.
You'll still see an error message.
I will not still see an error message. Nope. Nope. If you are trapping an exception, if you are catching an exception, then there is no exception, so there is no error message. I would have to throw an error either by using the throw keyword, or if you're a PowerShell guy, write error, because that's actually where we put errors. I could choose, while we're on the subject,
Did you just write that command?
the problem is that I can't tell my good jokes anymore because everybody knows what the punchline is.
Puppy just died. I think that's what he used last time.
There are legitimate reasons to use write host, and we will cover some of them later. This is not a legitimate reason. But this is something I see people do a lot. Write host is very discoverable. Freaking everybody on the intertubes uses it for stuff. Here's the #1 gotcha with it. If I just run this as is on my local computer, the fact that I've used write host will achieve my goal, right? It will do the thing I wanted it to do. I will get text on the screen telling me that it failed to connect to a computer, right? Sure. A, that text is going to show up right in the middle of my output, which is a little vexing, just visually. B, and this is important, I'm going to someday want to push this out via remoting to another computer. And that computer is going to run this, and when it hits that write host, that computer is going to try and put that message on that computer's screen, which I can't see, and there is no way for that host output to come back to me. So this is incompatible with PowerShell patterns because it does not support remoting. Everything is supposed to support remoting. For the most part, all you have to do is not be dumb, and PowerShell will do it for you. This is dumb. So what we need to do instead is change that to a write verbose, perhaps a write warning. Neither of those will interrupt the thing and make it quit working. Write error will. Write error will stop it. So use verbose, use warning, whichever you feel is appropriate for you. However, the verbose pipeline, let's go with verbose so we can make a point. The verbose pipeline is off by default. Normally, I will not see verbose output. How would I turn that on? How do I? What I need to do is enable square bracket, yep. That commandlet binding tells PowerShell that I want to get all of the common parameters, including minus verbose. I can now run my script. Let's save this with a different file name.
Is that your special version control?
So this is my special version control. This is so I can zip them up and give them to you. I don't use version control. Version control is for people who make mistakes. As I do not work in a production environment, I do not make mistakes. So with get OS info 2, I can hit -V and I have a verbose parameter built in. That will turn on the verbose pipeline for me. That is one of the 5, or in version 5.6, pipelines, right? You've got output, error, warning, verbose, debug, and then in version 5 you've got information. And the remoting system knows how to capture those pipelines and bring them back to you. So we're staying within the patterns of what PowerShell does. No write hosting. There is a legit use for write host, and we'll get there, but it's never in a tool.
Doing in the catch block $_ that'll just write the error without terminating, but I'll also do the rest of the catch block.
If you're in the catch block, you want to, yeah, so don't rely on $_ to do that, because that can get usurped by a lot of things. And if you go in and maintain your code and you forget that you use that and you do something that resets it, you break your code. Use $error *0 to get the most recent error from the error collection. But if you want to stick that inside of a write verbose so that you can actually see the error message, that's fine. And there's a lot of legit reasons to do that.
What about $_ exception?
$_ is almost always not the greatest thing to use.
Exception.
Well, but $_ itself is the object, and it can get usurped by a lot of different things. So go after it through the error record. So we have an ebook on PowerShell.org. You guys know the resources menu has an ebooks thing. We have a bunch of free ebooks. One of them is the big book of PowerShell error handling, which in fact is not big. It was meant to be ironic. And it covers the best way to actually get at the errors. And it's funny, there is no one right way because it kind of depends on the exception you're dealing with at the time. So it kind of walks you through the process.
But go back to commandlet binding. Once you do that, shouldn't you also then start handling all the other common parameters that you support?
So once I've put commandlet binding up, shouldn't I handle all the other common parameters? The beauty of it is I don't have to. I get -verbose for free, and if I'm using verbose, it'll work. I get minus debug for free. Now, I'm not providing any debugging functionality, but you'll find that most commandlets don't. Pretty much everything else is external functionality, like out variable and stuff like that. The shell just handles it for you.
The what if you have to put in.
So let's talk about that, since you mentioned the what if. And is that what you were thinking? This does not turn on what if or confirm. Just that does not turn on what if or confirm. I have to do this. Two things. Number one, having done that, my command's help will now show -what if and -confirm. I have not implemented that anywhere. So we'll talk about that as step one. Step two, my command isn't changing the system state. It's a get command. Get commands don't change the system state. They don't delete files. They don't make any modifications. You should not be supporting what if and confirm if you're not making modifications. That's what they're for. So that's the second thing. I should not have this in here because my command does not need it. It does not fit within the pattern. I'm not changing anything. However, getting back to the first thing, let's assume that I have some commands in here that are trying to change stuff. Do I need to do anything special to provide support for -what if or -confirm? The answer is maybe. Because by enabling this on my command, when someone runs my command with, let's say, -what if, that's going to pass through to all the other commands I run inside my script. So if I've tested them and they're already providing adequate support, I don't have to do anything different. However, there will be times when you want to do something that does not involve running a command. Maybe you're firing off a method of a .NET object. Well, they don't have what if and confirm. And so yes, in that case, I would need to manually implement what if and confirm. And we'll look at how to do that later. We'll write a command that modifies the system state in that fashion. But right now we're taking this out of here because it shouldn't be here. I invariably will look at scripts that have supports should process, and I will look at that script and they have not implemented that support, and or Their script isn't actually making any changes, and I know that that person found that on Google, and they don't know why it's there. But it works, so they leave it there. It only needs to be there if you actually need what if and confirm.
They use Control J,
Say again?
or they use Control J and use the same.
Or they used a template. I don't use templates. Real men type, also real women. Any more questions on this, where we are? He's having trouble swallowing that, but.
I was just wondering when you said when you add that, it implies the what if, through the rest of it. Can you do that with verbose without adding the verbose switch? Can you just make that right verbose, like imply to get sim instance verbose?
It does.
Oh, it does?
So yeah, all the common parameters become implied for every command you run. What's that? Not functions, commands. Commandlets, to be more precise. So if I were to run this now, let's just save it real quick.